conduct a public hearing to discuss the City of Cambridge getting to Net Zero Action Plan Fiscal Year 2017 Progress Report, as well as the Low Carbon Energy Supply Strategy, and to receive a general update on the Net Zero Action Plan. And we have present Council Carlone, and Council Devereaux sends her regrets. She was unable to join us because of a family situation, so she's traveling today.
And Council Kelly's out of town.
As well, okay. So, and this meeting is being audio and video recorded. And if anyone would like to sign up to speak, we have a sign-up sheet here. And if you have written comments you would like to enter into the record, please leave them with Madam Clerk. So I'll just make a few opening remarks. This journey began about 5 years ago when now State Representative Mike Conley, myself, John Pitkin, Dennis Carlone, and several other citizens and activists got together and filed a zoning petition, which led to the Net Zero Action Task Force, which led to the Net Zero Action Plan, which was adopted by the City Council in 2015. And we subsequently hired Seth to be our Net Zero planner. And the team is producing annual progress reports. And so we're here to review the Fiscal Year 17 progress report, which dates back almost a year ago now. And I believe this is the second report, right? So, welcome to the staff, and if you would like to introduce yourself.
Iram Farouk, Assistant City Manager for Community Development. Mr. Chair, you've provided a version of the introduction
Right.
that I might have given, so I'm just going to turn it over to Seth Sutherspiel.
Great, thanks, Aaron. And Suzanne Rasmussen, the Director of the Environmental and Transportation Planning Division, is frantically making the photocopies that I should have made before the meeting of the handout, so she'll be joining us shortly with hard copies. So thanks for having me today. Again, I'm happy to be giving an update to the committee and those here on the progress towards the Cambridge Net Zero Action Plan. So I'm going to give an overview of the content of the Fiscal Year 17 Action Plan Update Report, and then also give a brief overview of one of the specific projects that we completed in FY17, which is the Low Carbon Energy Supply Strategy. Okay, so Fiscal Year 17 was the second year of Net Zero Action Plan implementation, so still fairly early in the 25-year trajectory. So the actions in FY17 really focused on continuing to ramp up the Net Zero Action Plan as we continue to design programs. So, for example, researching what a local carbon fund might look like. Starting to pilot some initial programs. An example of that is our multifamily energy efficiency pilot that I'll be talking about. And then establishing resources that we need for ongoing implementation of the project. So on the communication side, getting into place communication materials that we can use on an ongoing basis. And the annual report consists of 3 components for each of the actions that were part of that year's activity. We have a qualitative action update to give a sense of is it on track, is it ahead, is it behind, as well as quantitative action outputs, so we can see the results of our actions, as well as a quantitative higher level project overview. And so in this case we can look to the city's greenhouse gas inventory as well as the annual building energy use disclosure ordinance reports to see how we're doing in terms of our overall greenhouse gas emissions. So this presentation really focuses on the first 2 of those. The higher level indicators change much more slowly, so there's not a lot to report on between the first the FY16 report and the FY17 report, but there is information on that in the FY17 report. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each action that was part of the FY17 action plan using this template. So for each action, I'll give an overview of what the action was about, and then I'll give a sense on a kind of green, yellow, red scale how we're doing in terms of the timing of implementing that action. I'll give a sense of the potential barriers to the action, as well as next steps for implementing it. And as Quentin mentioned, Councilor Zondervan mentioned, because FY17 ended at the end of July 2017, we're now quite a bit beyond FY17 in terms of implementation, so some of this information is a little bit anachronistic, but I'll kind of talk through where we are in terms of each of the actions today, as well as where we're going to be heading next. All right, so the first set of actions have to do with reducing energy consumption in existing buildings, and we had two actions in this action category in FY17. So 1.1.1 is the custom retrofit program, and 1.1.2 is investigating additional requirements for the building energy use disclosure ordinance. So the custom retrofit program is trying to think about how can we enable energy retrofits in buildings by building off of the state retrofit programs and making improvements to customize those programs for the Cambridge building stock. So in FY17, our goal is to begin implementation of a multifamily pilot program that focused on improving energy retrofit services for multifamily buildings between 5 and 50 units. And so this program launched about a year ago and has had quite a bit of success so far. We have over the year over 50 properties that have expressed interest in the program, 30 that have gone through energy assessments, and those assessments in those properties cover over 1,300 individual units, residential units in Cambridge. And what's really unique about this program is that it takes the baseline Mass Save energy efficiency offering from Massachusetts and tailors it to the Cambridge residential buildings by integrating not only energy efficiency assessments, but also renewable energy solar potential assessments. So the city, as part of this pilot, has brought on a solar consultant to help the buildings understand their solar potential and work through their options for installing solar. And then just in the last couple months, we've begun offering additional advising services to help the building decision makers really work through the full set of actions that come out of the energy and solar assessments and think about how they can implement those in a comprehensive way, including how they can access financing. And the city's been reaching out to a number of local financial institutions to help create financing options for these buildings. So as next steps for this, we're planning to continue this offering into FY19, but also begin scaling it up and thinking about how we can offer similar services to larger buildings in Cambridge, and I'll talk about that more in the next action. So that's looking at the building energy use disclosure ordinance and how we might introduce performance-based requirements to this ordinance. So when BUDO was passed in 2014, it was considered to have performance-based requirements, but because the Net Zero Action Plan was in progress at the time, the decision was to implement those requirements as part of the Net Zero Action Plan. So in FY17, we began researching what those requirements might look like based on similar requirements in other jurisdictions that have already adopted such requirements, as well as analyzing the BUDO data and thinking about, based on the actual reported energy data we have from these buildings, are there kind of breaking points where buildings above or below a certain threshold might be a good differentiation point for taking action. So we had a phase 1 kind of background information report completed in FY17, and now in FY18 we're moving on to phase 2 of the project, where we're working with stakeholders from the developer community, the universities, and other stakeholders who own and operate BUDO buildings to think about what form these potential requirements might actually take. And so we've had 2 out of 4 meetings over the last couple months to work on this, and I think we've been really pleased by the stakeholder engagement in this process in terms of how committed they are to working with the city to figure out a program that is both effective and efficient and feasible for the buildings. So I think we've had some very creative problem solving so far. And moving forward, we're looking forward to seeing how these requirements can really dovetail with that expansion of the custom retrofit program, which would enable the actual energy savings. So a potential requirement for the buildings could be to complete an audit every few years. Then the custom retrofit program would voluntarily offer a streamlined pathway to completing the actions recommended by that audit. So we're trying to merge multiple actions in the Net Zero Action Plan to make them more efficient and actually more effective in their outcomes. All right. So the next set of actions fall into actions for new construction and encouraging greater energy performance in those. So we have actions that fall into incentive categories. The first two, we have requirements and zoning, the 2.3 and 2.5, and then we have our own leadership by example in 2.4. So I'll go through each of these. So action 2.1 is researching a market-based incentive program, so some sort of monetary incentives for buildings in the market to improve their energy performance beyond the minimums. So in FY17, we had a Harvard University student fellow research potential market incentives based on precedents from around the country, with the goal of figuring out if we could develop a market incentive that did not require the city or other institutions kind of infusing outside money, and also did not penalize buildings for meeting the minimum requirements that we do have in the city. And we found through the research that it's very challenging to meet both of those conditions, because to make a meaningful impact on the building's performance, developers gave us the feedback that a fairly sizable incentive is necessary. And so either that needs to come from outside funding, or there is the idea in the Net Zero Task Force of a fee and rebate system where high-performing buildings would be given a rebate that was paid for by a fee levied on lower-performing buildings. The issue is that if all buildings should be meeting our minimum building code standards, and therefore to charge those buildings a fee would be inequitable. So the conclusion of the study is that an independent market incentive program may not be viable, but what might be more effective as an incentive would be a density-based zoning incentive, and that's what I'll be talking about in the next action. But we are continuing. We still have that fellow on board now as an intern, and she's looking at potential linkages between this policy idea and the bureau requirements, so potentially by expanding market program to not only new buildings but also existing buildings, and also potentially linking it to the local carbon offset fund, which I'll be talking about, could kind of create more flexibility in the market incentive program. So on the topic of density or height and floor area ratio bonuses, again, there was the feedback from the market incentive program was that this was really the most effective incentive for developers in Cambridge. This action is behind the original schedule because we've been working to integrate this planning process with the Envision Cambridge planning process, which is looking at the potential use of zoning incentives for a number of community benefits, which could include energy environment, could also include community goals like more affordable housing or more open space. And so right now we're looking at kind of what the magnitude of the density bonus would need to be to affect the energy performance of buildings, and what the feasibility is of sharing density bonuses among multiple community goals. So could we give a partial density bonus for net zero and a partial density bonus for affordable housing? So we're working, as I said, right now with the Envision Cambridge consultants to kind of parse out what that balance might look like. All right, so the next action is a regulatory action by the city to adopt stricter green building standards through the zoning code. This action has also been delayed because when we initially started investigating this action, shortly after the Net Zero Action Plan was adopted, we came against the barrier that it's the state of Massachusetts that regulates energy performance of new buildings through the state building code. And so local jurisdictions like the city don't have the authority to set standards that go above and beyond that code, beyond adopting the energy stretch code, which Cambridge has done. So what we're recommending moving forward with is changing the LEED criteria from silver to gold for old buildings, because that's all buildings, because that's an outcome-based standards as opposed to a prescriptive standard. Also adopting the enhanced commissioning credit as recommended by the Net Zero Action Plan. We're utilizing the new stretch code to meet the energy performance that we were originally looking for in this action. And then moving forward, we're trying to look at what could more outcome-based energy performance standards be that we could adopt that would not overlap with the state building code. And so we're working with a collaborative of 10 cities across the country through the Urban Sustainable Directors Network. It's called the Zero Cities Project. And through that project, we're specifically taking on this question of moving forward, how could we look at performance-based standards for buildings that do not conflict with the building code. But in the meantime, we are drafting language for these measures here, and that zoning amendment language we're hoping to advance to City Council over the next couple months. And that would pertain to Action 2.3 as well as 2.5, which I'll get to in a minute, which is enabling increased exterior insulation on buildings. So before I get to the exterior insulation, on the municipal building side, we have actions looking at both new and existing municipal buildings. And for new municipal buildings, the goal is for those buildings to be net zero ready as we're constructing them today, which leads us to the net zero requirement for new municipal buildings in 2020. And so, thank you very much. We have a couple of examples of new buildings that are doing a really great job of achieving this net zero readiness. And what net zero ready means to us is buildings that are running solely on fuels that have the potential to be renewable. So in our case, all electric buildings or fossil fuel free buildings. So a couple of examples of these, just up the street is 859 Mass Ave, which the city has been doing a gut renovation on. And so that building is using a combination of ground source heat pumps and solar to power its heating and cooling systems as well as the electricity. And then of course is the King Open complex on Cambridge Street, which is a particularly unique example of a net zero ready building because of the magnitude of the building and the mixed uses going into that building. And so that building will also be fossil fuel free, using extensive heat pumps and a very large solar system on the roof. But that solar system will cover a good chunk of that building's energy use. And then the net zero ready part is that if and when the city transitions its electricity supply to 100% renewable electricity, at that point those buildings would be considered net zero emissions. And so outside of this project, we are pursuing studying what it would take to transition the electricity supply for the city to 100% renewable energy. So great examples in the city buildings, new buildings. And then for existing buildings, we're pursuing energy efficient retrofits through our Municipal Facilities Improvement Plan, which is an ongoing process to really prioritize and look at ways to improve our buildings, not only for energy, but also for accessibility and functionality. But all of these projects do take energy into account. And in FY17, there were 6 energy efficiency and renewable energy projects. And there's another 11 or 12 underway now. And the outcomes of those FY17 projects included about 250 kilowatts of solar, upgrades to heating and cooling systems, LED lighting retrofits, and improvements to the building envelopes.
Could you give us an example of which buildings, just a couple of those 6?
Should I get Owen to help with that?
So, let me see if I
You
can
could do it later too.
If I could do it later, that would be
Yeah.
And so both the new building program and the existing building retrofit program will help us meet our municipal greenhouse gas reduction targets that we have for 2020, and now we're looking out ahead to 2030 as well.
So I can provide that to you now. So we've got Kennedy Longfellow. We're obviously putting a PV array that has just become active in terms of its integration now with the Eversource electrical system. The senior centre, we have a new patio on the first floor of the senior centre, and there's a 10 kilowatt PV array on top of that. There's an opening ceremony of that on the 13th of June. We have the Fletcher Maynard Academy. There's going to be a PV array put on that. 859 Mass Avenue, which you've already spoken about. We're also doing a retrofit of the Taylor Square Firehouse. And again, we expect to have geothermal wells at that location. And on the 3rd Street fire station, we expect to install geothermal wells there as well.
Thank you.
That's a quick summary.
Impressive.
Thank you very much. So our last action for new buildings, and this relates to existing buildings as well, is again the zoning amendment that I mentioned for adding additional insulation to the outside of buildings. This can be a very cost-effective way to increase the energy performance. But in Cambridge, where everything is very tight together, there can be issues with the setbacks. So there's currently language in Article 22 of the zoning ordinance that provides some flexibility to adding additional insulation. And based on a technical feasibility study that we completed, we're recommending changes to the zoning language that would increase the amount of insulation we could add to the buildings and decrease the required setback. And in some cases where the setback is still an issue, to set up a special permit review process so that there could be case-by-case evaluation of the feasibility of making those changes. So again, this along with the lead changes are being advanced together in the zoning package over the next couple months. Moving along to renewable energy supply. In FY17, we completed the low carbon energy supply strategy study that I'll be talking about more in a little bit. We also continued to make progress towards solar ready rooftops and worked with our local utilities on memorandum of understanding. So I'm going to skip over the low carbon energy supply strategy for now because I'll be talking about that more in a bit, but the study was completed on time over the course of FY17 and was published this spring. For rooftop solar ready, we had completed a study of this in FY16 and we're pursuing adoption when the state kind of actually got out ahead of us and included solar readiness in the state building code, which is great. The only challenge with that in Cambridge is that the state code only applies to buildings up through 3 stories, and so for taller buildings there leaves a gap there. We are seeing that in Cambridge, most buildings that are coming in for special permits, even larger buildings, are including solar readiness as part of their building design, so that's a good thing. And then moving forward, it's in the calendar for FY19 to look at a solar installation requirement. You may have heard the news out of California that the state of California is now requiring new residential buildings to actually install solar panels under construction. And so we'll be researching the feasibility of a similar policy in Cambridge. And so moving forward, we're going to look at how we can kind of leapfrog solar ready and go straight to the solar installation requirement. Working with local utilities, the process of negotiating a formal MOU has been going slower than we'd hoped because of utilities' concern over the scope of that MOU. But we've made pretty good progress on more targeted project involvement. So as we'll be talking about on the low carbon energy supply strategy process, we had a multi-stakeholder advisory committee for that project, including both Eversource and Veolia. And they were both quite engaged in that project. They came to every single meeting and had a lot of constructive feedback, and I think are really interested in continuing to engage with the city over implementation of that strategy. And so I think, even without a formal MOU in place, we can continue to engage with the community, the utilities on a targeted project basis.
Excuse me, Seth, is
Yes.
there concern losing clientele to some extent or losing the market?
I don't think so. The MOU that we were working on them was mostly focused on kind of an agreement between the municipality and the utility, and it would include things like what the level of utility incentives would be for the retrofit programs that we were talking about. But we had also been making requests about data sharing, and kind of other collaborative measures. And I don't know if you want to speak to this anymore.
And
but
just infrastructure improvements and getting a better sense in terms of just their planning around infrastructure improvements
Right.
as well, so as to better electrify systems.
Yeah,
Right.
so,
And could you explain LCESS?
yeah, so that's the low carbon energy supply
Oh.
strategy. Yeah. All right. Action category 4 is the local carbon fund, which is investigating the possibility of implementing a local carbon offset fund. So you're probably familiar with carbon offsets, where you can kind of take credit for emission saving activity in one place for your emissions in your location. To add flexibility to the net zero action plan requirements, we're studying what a local carbon fund could look like, so that if a new building couldn't meet its requirements on site, it could invest in carbon saving projects within Cambridge to offset that requirement. And that way we continue to make direct progress towards our Cambridge net zero emissions goals, while adding flexibility to the policies. So in FY17 we began study of this, again looking at precedents from other communities and thinking about what kind of the key policy questions would be in Cambridge in terms of the scope of offsets, the temporal nature, how we deal with electrification of buildings, and what we're doing now is looking at the actual program design of how that fund could work. So who would administer it, where would financing come from, what is the likely demand for offsets. And so to study that implementation, we've been working with, again, stakeholders throughout the community, so universities, developers, and other stakeholders who might be interested in utilizing the fund to buy offsets, utilizing the fund to invest in energy saving projects on their properties, or potentially both. And I think particularly with Harvard just recently announced, for example, a fossil fuel neutral goal by 2026, which implies the use of offsets. So I think we're seeing more and more interest in these kind of flexible mechanisms. So next up for this will be kind of seeing how we start to flesh that out into a potential program. And then the last action category is engagement and capacity building with the community. So again, this is more about setting the framework for the success of all the other actions in the Net Zero Action Plan through communications and capacity building. And so on the communications front, in FY17, we continue to make effort to communicate about the results of the plan with the community, and obviously this report is an example of that. We've gotten a lot of regional interest in the Net Zero Action Plan, which I think is really one of the goals of the Net Zero Action Planners, and Henrietta deserves major kudos for going on her road tour of all the neighboring cities and towns to really answer their questions and help those communities use this as a model. So Lexington has adopted a Net Zero Action planning process. Concord is working on it. I live in Arlington, and I just heard that they applied for a grant to work on these efforts as well. So the ripple effect is rippling, which is very exciting. We also worked on more visual materials for the Net Zero Action Plan. There's been hubway ads and kind of a comprehensive illustration that we can pull pieces from. We're working on updating the program website to be more interactive and integrate with our environmental sustainability dashboard that we developed. And hoping in the next few weeks to come out with a Net Zero Action Plan newsletter that would encapsulate some of these updates and help folks throughout the community know what's coming up next. In terms of project management capacity, again, all these mechanisms are part of this, making sure that we're staying on track. This report was received and approved by the Climate Protection Action Committee, which is responsible for kind of regular oversight of the Net Zero Action Plan, along with City Council. And we're already starting to look ahead to fiscal year 20, which is when we'll have our first top-to-bottom program-wide review. The Net Zero Action Plan committed to every 5 years, really looking at comprehensively, where are we ahead of schedule, where are we behind schedule, how are technologies and policies changing that we might want to make adjustments to the plan. So starting in FY19, this next year, we'll be thinking about how we're going to scope that program-wide review in FY20. And finally, a great example of community collaboration in the Net Zero Action Plan has been our Net Zero Lab working group. Labs are some of the most challenging buildings to reduce energy consumption from, but also some of the most important because of their high levels of energy use. So through the Cambridge Compact for a Sustainable Future, which is a partnership between the city, originally the city, Harvard, and MIT, and has expanded out to include quite a few large businesses in the city. This Net Zero Lab working group is led by the co-chairs from Harvard and Novartis, a private sector lab, to look at opportunities for identifying energy reduction potential in labs. So in FY17, they completed a benchmarking study to understand better where energy is being used in labs at a more granular level than we get through the building energy use disclosure reports. And from that study, they're now working on identifying next steps to actually start piloting some potential strategies in labs. And they've been very involved in the BUTO amendment process that I was talking about earlier, because most of the labs do report to BUTO, and we're trying to think about, do we need a kind of unique set of requirements for labs that would work for them. So my last slide for the fiscal year 17 report is looking ahead to fiscal year 19, since we are at the end of fiscal year 18, technically. So some of the key actions that we're looking forward to in the next year, and this is kind of in order of immediacy. So really starting out with the green building zoning ordinance amendments that would increase the LEED standards and enable the exterior insulation. Then really pursuing some of the recommendations that come out of the low carbon energy supply strategy, which I'm about to get to, so stop keeping you in suspense on that. And that can include the study of the rooftop solar requirement that I mentioned, since obviously that's an important part of our local energy supply. Continuing pursuit of the BUTO amendments along with that custom retrofit program to really create that comprehensive and balanced approach where there's both requirements and enabling programs to get to the energy retrofits that we're looking for. And then I mentioned earlier this Urban Sustainable Directors Network project called Zero Cities, where we're collaborating with other cities around the country who are also working on net zero planning. And through that project, we're not only looking at the performance requirements I mentioned earlier, but also really trying to understand where leverage points are with buildings to achieve greater levels of energy upgrades. So one example of that could be when buildings change ownership or are renovated, and should there be some sort of standards or requirements at that point to drive action. And the governor actually just recently released a draft bill that would require residential buildings to conduct an energy audit before they are sold. So that would be an example of that kind of point of sale action. So I want to pause there. Happy to take any questions on the fiscal year 17 report. Councillor Cohen.
Just one quick thing, Mr. Chair. When you mentioned that buildings might be upgraded, have requirements when they're going to be renovated. Well, one reason buildings renovate is, well, the tipping point might be that they have to be upgraded within 10 years or 20 years, whatever you establish, assuming we can do this legally, and that might be enough to force to make the renovation occur. What I mean by that is at that time period, already windows need to be sealed and insulation needs to be upgraded, or if the roof needs repair. If this is added, they will consider more doing the whole building over. Sure. That tipping point indeed could be what we want them to do. And you can make it a generous amount of years, but you know, maybe 20 years is not at all restrictive, and maybe it's too easy, but I can't believe anybody would say in 20 years this is unreasonable given where we're going, and maybe we can shorten that.
I do have a couple of questions. Could you say a little bit more about the custom retrofit program?
Sure, so the multifamily pilot specifically, or
No, just
in
the
general?
overall, yes.
So,
overall.
so again, the goal is to make it easier for buildings to actually make the types of energy retrofits that we're looking for. And so we really leverage the state Mass Save energy efficiency program for this, because through the utilities, there's significant incentive funding available for buildings to do these retrofits. So residential buildings, for example, can get a free energy assessment, can get insulation at 75% off, free LEDs and energy saving appliances. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to take those state programs and customize them to work for Cambridge buildings, because we know that the average Cambridge residential building does not look like the average Massachusetts residential building. We have apartment buildings, and the rest of the state has single family homes. The average Cambridge commercial building also doesn't look like the average Massachusetts commercial building. We have mixed-use buildings with laboratories and office space, and ground floor retail, whereas other parts of the state might have single-story, single-use commercial buildings. So we're trying to really work closely with the utilities who run the state programs to make those programs work better here. So the multifamily pilot is a great example of that, because we've said, what is your existing multifamily program, and how can we make that work better in Cambridge by making sure that we're offering the services that Cambridge buildings need and want, and then integrating those services with the advice that the buildings need to take action on them. And so that's where the solar advisor and the retrofit advisor services that we're piloting are really unique, because they add that renewable energy component, which isn't currently part of the state program, and then they give the building decision makers the tools and advice they need to actually take action. And so we're paying very close attention right now, because the state is going through a rewriting of its statewide energy efficiency plan. It's called the 3-year energy efficiency action plan. And this is something that the public can comment on, so I encourage members of the public to take a look at this process, because we're trying to advocate for that statewide plan to, again, learn from our lessons through our pilots and become more effective. So for example, they are starting to think about including renewables in their state baseline assessments. They're also looking at how they can provide much better services for renters, because of course in Cambridge, 2/3 of our residents are renters, which is much higher than the statewide number. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. In terms of the municipal standards, so the target is 2020, and if we are promulgating those standards 24 months before then that means basically now. So where are we with that?
Yeah, so for municipal buildings, so we've adopted the net zero ready approach to our new buildings, and I think that's really getting us very much on the pathway to net zero. But we are working on defining some of the key terms that will apply not only to municipal buildings but for all of the buildings. So for example, through the offset fund study, we're looking at what offsets would mean, and it's possible that the city buildings would utilize offsets along with private sector buildings. So that study has been really helpful to clarify some of those key questions. So example, one of those key questions that has come up is, as we'll be talking about in the low carbon energy supply strategy, a key strategy is taking heating and cooling systems and taking them off of fossil fuels and onto electricity. But current electricity prices and also emission factors could actually disincentivize electrification, because electricity is more expensive than natural gas, and electricity on today's regional electricity grid has a higher emissions factor than natural gas burned in your home. We see that changing over time, right? So we want to incentivize getting onto electricity now, so that as the grid gets cleaner over time, so does your building. So figuring out how we set up the program structure to avoid disincentivizing that electrification. So those are the key programmatic questions that we're looking at that would affect both the municipal buildings, but then set us up for the net zero standards for small residential buildings in 2022. And it's really getting ready for that. That will be teeing up the 2-year, very much public engagement process around setting those standards. So we have a little more flexibility with the municipal. since
Right, 'cause
it's ours.
but it would be helpful maybe to have an official statement of what we mean when we say net zero ready, cause
Yeah.
when we engage with private developers, you know, they ask us, well, what do you mean net zero
Yeah.
ready? So we had a official definition of that would be potentially helpful. I think those are all the qualifying questions I have for now.
Seth and Aram, your presentation comments about developers saying that this is a potentially excessive costs and there has to be compensation. I've worked on green buildings, and what I learned was the amount of glass has everything to do with the heat and cooling costs. I know you know this, but developers insist on maximizing the glass in their buildings. And I've spoken to a number of architects on those big buildings, and they all say they do everything possible energy-wise so they can maintain that. And I said, well, doesn't that mean if you lessen the glass, that you would have even better energy savings? And they don't want to hear that. So architecturally, there's no question in my mind that all glass or much glass buildings are frankly dull and boring and have nothing to do with a livable image of a city. In fact, they're blank, and there are studies on this. I don't have to get to it. So I know the state is saying, and maybe in this, it's already been approved, that glass can't be more than, I think, 50% on commercial buildings, or at least that's proposed. Engineers say we don't need more than 40%. That's in the engineering code. You probably know that. And so it seems to me that's an obvious place. And glass is the most expensive material in building a building. So when you developers tell you that, I really question it. And I'm sure there's extra costs, but granted, mine have been low-rise buildings, although some were institutional. There wasn't much of an increase. It was just logic.
Yeah,
So
thanks for that perspective.
I hope you present that when you talk to them, because it's a game.
Yeah, and one of the things that I did mean to mention in the Action 2.3, the green building zoning requirement amendments, we are looking to also introduce language in those requirements to encourage more early dialogue with the developers, so that we can really have a conversation with them very early in the building design process about the overall holistic design of that building and how that affects energy performance. And so materials and window to wall ratio would very much be a part of that conversation.
Good.
And we want to have that conversation early on enough so that there's still an opportunity to change those designs. And as part of that, we're hoping to connect developers to the incentives that are available. Mass Save offers specific incentives in the design phase of buildings where they will pay for a green building designer to work with the development team and identify opportunities for increasing the energy performance. They'll pay for early building energy modeling, which is where you can actually see the trade-offs and see how much of a difference it makes to have 50% glass versus 100% glass. And then they will give a monetary incentive based on the energy savings of the final building design compared to a baseline.
Excellent.
And just to add to that, one of the elements that we've started already talking to developers about and would make more explicit through these changes would be emphasis on passive design as well, so that it isn't just about mechanical ways to gain energy efficiency, but just through better building
Excellent.
design overall. Just a couple things that I wanted to add is that, hopefully it was clear from Seth's presentation that we've talked a lot about city side work like regulations, incentives, and so on, but the Net Zero Action Plan is as much a roadmap for collective action as it is for municipal intervention in action. And I think that some of the ideas that Seth mentioned, such as the work that the Cambridge Compact for Sustainable Futures Sustainable Future is doing in terms of the Net Zero Labs project, which is really driven not by the city, but by business and institutions to try to figure out ways to get ahead of the curve, is something that is exactly what we had been hoping to achieve. And similarly, that group is working on thinking about renewable energy purchase and storage, which are really, when you get to the storage question, that's one of the big hurdles right now, and they're starting to look into that with research projects led by right now Harvard. But so those kinds of things where the businesses, the institutions, the larger energy users are getting as involved in trying to find solutions as we are as the city, is, I think, one of the wonderful side benefits of this action plan that we created. So thanks to everybody who was the catalyst for that.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next one, and we can come back.
Great. So next I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the low carbon energy supply strategy. This is, again, one of the key actions in the Net Zero Action Plan, to look at our energy, renewable energy supply. And just to preface this, I didn't include in the slides here, but we have a graph from the Net Zero Action Plan that shows how much energy savings we expect to get from energy efficiency and how much from renewable energy. And the bulk really is from energy efficiency. And so we really do still prioritize the energy efficiency approaches, because obviously energy that you don't use to begin with is energy that you don't have to create. But that said, we will still have to use some energy. And so over time, strategizing how we can transition from our current largely fossil fuel-based energy supply to a fossil fuel-free energy supply was the goal of this study. So we hired a consultant team led by Renewable engineering company, which is based out of Denmark, partly because of their extensive experience with district energy systems, which I'll be talking about here, as very important for Cambridge. And so they completed the study over the course of a little over a year to really look comprehensively at where we are now with energy supply in Cambridge. I'm going to flip to the next slide. So the first part of the study was looking at where we are now with energy supply in Cambridge, and how that energy supply matches up against our demand today and the demand for energy that we anticipate into the future. The second part of the study was based on those projections to basically brainstorm a whole list of energy supply scenarios that could meet our future energy demand with different combinations of energy resources. The third part of the study was thinking about how we would actually make that transition, what tools we need to use for that transition. And the fourth part of the study was to assess a set of final scenarios on a quantitative level to understand the resulting emissions for those scenarios, as well as the relative costs of the scenarios. So I'm going to briefly walk through each of those four study areas and then get to the main conclusion. So looking at Cambridge energy demand today, you can see that in Cambridge, the majority of our energy demand is for heating our buildings. And this is not surprising, though this will shift over time as the climate continues to change and we go from more of a heating-dominated climate to a much more even split between heating and cooling. I do want to mention that this cooling proportion here this is only separate cooling or central cooling. So a window air conditioner gets lumped into the electricity demand. So some of the cooling demand now is hidden in that electricity, and over time that will continue to be the case, though we do anticipate more central cooling systems. The conclusion from this is that we really need to focus on that thermal demand, whether it's heating or cooling, if we're going to successfully decarbonize the energy supply in Cambridge. Particularly because currently it's the thermal demand that's the energy that we produce more locally, whereas electricity is coming from the regional grid. So currently that thermal demand, as you can see, is mostly supplied by natural gas. And that natural gas is responsible for about half of our citywide greenhouse gas emissions. This is a graph from our citywide greenhouse gas inventory. So definitely key to achieving our greenhouse gas reduction goals. So one of the first things that Renewable did was they mapped the energy demand in Cambridge based on both reported energy data through Bureau and then modeling energy data for smaller buildings. And so we see this pattern of hotspots in the city. So this is for heating today. So we see hot spots, unsurprisingly, in the Kendall Square and MIT areas, in Harvard Square areas, in East Cambridge, somewhat in the Alewife. So the dense areas of the city. And then in the less dense residential areas of the city, we see these lighter colors, which represent less energy demand density. Over time, this shows anticipated energy demand in 2030, and then in 2040, we see a cooling of this heating demand because of climate change. So we see less need for heating, except for in the areas of the city that are most developing. So here's Volpe, here's the quadrangle in Alewife, and here's North Point. On the cooling side, we see a very similar pattern with the energy demand highest in those same areas. But over time, now instead of a diminishing of demand, we see increasing demand really citywide and particularly concentrated in those densest areas of the city. So kind of keep this pattern in mind because this pattern is what we're going to use to set up the scenarios for energy supply. But first we looked at the current energy supply and we looked at possibilities at the local immediate scale, at the kind of regional scale, and then at the larger New England scale for a variety of renewable energy supply options. So on the electricity side, we have solar, which can be locally on rooftops or regionally in larger solar farms. We looked at wind, which we don't have capacity for in Cambridge, but can be both regionally land-based or on a larger scale offshore. And then we looked at a whole host of potential thermal energy sources. And this is one of the most fun parts of the project for me, was looking at these really creative sources of wasted heat in particular. So on the top left here, we have pictures of a ground source heat pump system. On the top right, we have solar thermal. Here we have looking at sewer systems, and could we potentially extract heat from the sewers, all that hot water that goes down your shower drain. Could we get energy from anaerobic digestion, like at Deer Island? Could we take heat from refrigeration at electricity transformer stations, from grocery stores, from skating rinks? Or could we even take heat out of the tea tunnels? The conclusion of these studies is, unfortunately, none of these is a really large heat source in Cambridge. So together they can add up to bits and pieces, but we continue to need to look outside of Cambridge for the majority of our energy supply. And so that starts to get us into our scenarios. So this map is based off of those heat maps, and you can see that the consultant divided the city into zones. So zone 1 in purple are the high energy density zones now that were the darkest colors in the heat map. And zone 2 in blue is the residential zones, the lower energy density areas. And zones 3, 4, and 5 are the transforming zones where we're seeing an increase in energy demand as they develop. As we brainstormed a whole bunch of different potential energy supply scenarios, we wanted to look not only at the emissions and cost impact of the scenarios, but also on a more qualitative level, how they affect other factors that are important to Cambridge. So certainly resiliency is of increasing importance, but also things like control over energy, choice over energy supply, equity impacts for all of Cambridge residents, and how does energy supply affect their economics and quality of life. And so we use those factors to rate a whole bunch of different options, and we came down to these 3 potential alternative scenarios, which we compared against a business as usual scenario. So the first scenario is what we call individual electrification, and I've illustrated this with a residential building. And so this residential building has what's called an air source heat pump, which uses electricity to very efficiently extract heat from the outside air and bring it into the building to heat it, or to cool it in reverse in the summer. And this is what the indoor unit looks like, and we actually have one right here.
And it's on really high.
I
You
guess
notice that we had to put our coats on?
It's warm under the lights here. I feel like I'm.
It's all right, okay, just saying.
So this building, in addition to the heat pump to provide its heating and cooling, has solar panels to provide the electricity it needs. So this could be a totally self-sufficient building. And these solutions can be scaled up. So we have heat pumps that can work for very large buildings that are both air source like this one or ground source like many of the municipal buildings have. And so the advantage of this strategy is that each individual building is kind of self-contained. We can retrofit buildings over time as they kind of go through their natural retrofit cycles. The disadvantage of this scenario is that because of that piece by piece retrofit, it takes a long time and it's quite expensive. And in particular, it requires a lot of outside electricity, because while this relatively small home might be self-sufficient from an energy standpoint, a large office building isn't going to have enough roof space to create all of the electricity it needs. So we're going to have to draw a lot more electricity from the grid. So we took that scenario and said, well, what if we kept using electricity as our fuel source, but we added district energy infrastructure? And district energy is heating and cooling systems that, instead of our individual building focused, are shared within a district or neighborhood. And so here you can see a diagram of how this can work. You have a central energy plant that can produce both heating and cooling. And these plants can be fueled by many different fuel sources. So it can be electricity from conventional electricity from the grid, or renewables like wind and solar. It could be by natural gas. It could be by biomass. It could be by waste to energy. So you have flexibility in your fuel source at the plant, and then that plant creates heating and cooling, which travels through pipes in the ground that go to the buildings in the area. And so the advantage of this system is that there's a lot more efficiency built into the system. You have much more economy of scale at the energy plant. And then you also have built-in storage in the system, because you can, the pipes themselves, they hold usually either steam or hot water. Hot water is more efficient, so that's the direction you want to go in. And that hot water stays warm over time. So even if the plant turns off for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or a couple hours, your system keeps carrying the thermal energy. You can also add storage tanks to the system for greater levels of resiliency. It's also more flexible over time, because once you get the building set up to accept the district energy, you only have to change one fuel source at the plant to convert the fuel source for all of the buildings. Whereas with the individual electrification approach, each individual building had to be converted to the electricity. In our third scenario, we took that district energy idea, and instead of looking at electricity as our sole fuel source, which would still require a lot more electricity from the grid, we looked at alternative fuel sources. So like I mentioned, we looked at the potential to use biomass, the potential to use waste in the form of waste incineration or anaerobic digestion. You can use natural gas to fire these, though obviously natural gas is a fossil fuel, so they'd be concerned about that. And so the advantage of having the energy produced on site is that it would give Cambridge more control over that energy source. So instead of utilizing the regional grid and depending on that grid to decarbonize, if we could find a satisfactory carbon neutral fuel to power combined heat and power plants within Cambridge, we would have much more control over that fuel source. So those were the scenarios that we chose to advance for the assessment. And then as we were assessing the scenarios, we also looked at how do we involve the community in this process today and in the future to actually achieve this energy transition. And so we thought this study was a really great opportunity to do public education around energy supply and individual choices that folks can make to decarbonize their energy supply. So we created this handy infographic poster, which you can see on our website. Took that around to a bunch of our events, and then used our stakeholder conversation to our stakeholder advisory conversation to really think about what it would take to to achieve the transition to these energy sources. And then finally, in Work Package 4, we completed the technical feasibility assessment, where we looked at the costs and the relative emissions of the different scenarios, with the goals of achieving our decarbonization goals in a way that's both cost effective and, again, meets those community goals that I showed earlier. So I apologize that these numbers are a little bit small. Hopefully you can read them on your handouts. So these are the emissions results of those 3 scenarios that we assessed compared to the business as usual. So the business as usual indicates quite a high level of ongoing carbon dioxide emissions out to 2040. So this would not be a pathway to achieving our carbon neutral goal. As we look at the different scenarios, the individual electrification scenario has a much lower emissions than the business as usual, but still significant emissions because the consultant assumed that the current policies for the electricity grid, so the current RPS increase of 1% a year and the current regional greenhouse gas initiative trajectory for power plants in New England. And while that decreases emissions, it doesn't get the grid to carbon neutral by 2040. So that's why we still have remaining emissions, is because we're relying on that electrical grid. If that electrical grid were to decarbonize more quickly, then both of these electrification scenarios would have lower emission numbers. They found that the local combined heat and power scenario, powered by biomass, had the potential for having the lowest emissions, with the very large assumption that we are not have not concluded on yet that biomass could be carbon neutral. So we're not saying it is, and there's a lot more study that needs to be done there. But if we were able to find a carbon neutral fuel source, be it biomass or something else, then that would have the lowest emissions, because the only remaining emissions would be the electrical grid emissions to power the electricity needs of the buildings. And again, if the electricity grid were to decarbonize more quickly, then that would lower those emissions further. In looking at the cost of these scenarios, I think we were fairly pleasantly, we were happy to see that the alternative scenarios compared pretty favorably to the business as usual. And what's worth noting here is that across all the scenarios, the fuel costs are by far the greatest cost to the scenarios over time. So this is the total cost over the 25-year study period. And so fluctuation in fuel prices will have a huge impact. So if electricity prices go up, then the high electricity use scenarios will become more costly. If they go down, they'll be less costly. So again, a real advantage of the local energy supply scenario is that there's less dependence on that kind of regional electricity pricing. The other big cost is the capital investment. And so we do see higher capital costs for the alternative scenarios than the business as usual, because we'll have to be changing over the energy delivery system. But again, when you balance out those capital costs, particularly of the district energy scenarios, we're actually quite close to the business as usual. The higher capital costs of the electrical scenarios are mostly due to the need to strengthen the electricity infrastructure to be able to bring in so much more electricity to Cambridge. Okay, so a handful of key conclusions, and then happy to answer questions. So we laid out these different scenarios to kind of set some goalposts for how we might decarbonize the energy supply in Cambridge, but in reality we certainly acknowledge that it'll be a combination of these strategies, and figuring out what level of which strategy will be something to figure out over time. But it's very clear that if we are to meet our carbon neutral goals, that we need to get off of this business as usual trajectory. Electrification is likely to play a pretty central role in our strategy, but individual building electrification is likely quite expensive, and so that's where we really see the advantages of utilizing district energy infrastructure. That district energy infrastructure comes with additional benefits beyond cost. So as I mentioned earlier, there's greater resiliency in the system, more flexibility of fuel sources, and that adaptability over time. But at the end of the day, because we're going to be bringing energy into Cambridge, regardless if it's electrical energy or waste or biomass to power local energy plants, we're doing this within a regional network. And so this isn't just a Cambridge action plan. And so it was really helpful to have stakeholders from Boston and Somerville, the state, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council as part of our advisory committee for this project. And as we look forward to implementation, we really want to continue to work on that regional level to tackle a lot of these questions that we're facing, because ultimately we feel like pursuing these strategies collaboratively will be a more effective route to getting where we need to go. So those implementation steps, because we know that particularly in the residential areas, it does make sense to pursue that electrification pathway. We want to continue with the programs that we're already doing to encourage this. So our Sunny Cambridge program helps residential buildings go solar. And then we're in the process of putting together a renewable thermal program that will help those buildings switch over from natural gas or oil heating to renewable heating sources like the ground source and air source heat pumps. And then getting to some of those bigger questions around the district energy infrastructure, figuring out if biomass is a viable fuel source or if we should be looking to other options. That's where we really want to pursue this conversation at a regional level. And we're excited. We just, in the last week, found out that we've been awarded a technical assistance grant from MAPC to, together with Boston and Somerville, research what a regulatory framework for water-based district energy would be. The current district energy systems in Cambridge, and there is district energy in Cambridge quite a bit. So I should have mentioned that Harvard, MIT, and Veolia all own sizable district energy systems. Those are based on steam, which is less efficient than hot water, but there's no regulatory framework for hot water. So through this grant, we're going to research what it would take to set the regulatory framework for hot water district energy, which can hopefully be the first step to converting and developing more of those systems. So that's our kind of immediate set of next steps, and like the Net Zero Action Plan as a whole, I think this strategy will really play out over time. So that's what I have, and happy to answer additional questions.
Thank you so much. Councilor Cullen?
When we talk about district heating or cooling, are 3 in Cambridge enough, or I'm thinking of Alewife in particular, the no man's land where there's no infrastructure to speak of, no matter what you're talking about. And my gut tells me we have to move on this if we're going to talk about having a piece of land that could build a facility. Maybe the other 3 are sufficient. I kind of doubt it, but I don't know. So when you talk about a district-wide plan, how big is a district? What's feasible?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I went back to the map. So MIT's system covers MIT pretty well and actually kind of overlaps with the Veolia system in East Cambridge. The Veolia system could potentially expand to cover North Point pretty well. The Volpe zoning includes language that requires the developers to look at district energy potential. The Harvard system covers mid-Cambridge pretty well, and as you know, extends into Alston. But yes, currently there isn't the infrastructure in Alewife. So we're actually right now doing a small study, kind of follow-on study with Renewable to design, based on the Envision Cambridge Alewife plan, to design a schematic layout of what a district energy network could be in Alewife. And so that way we will have those schematic plans as part of the Envision Cambridge Alewife document, so that as development decisions are being made moving forward, we at least have that baseline information of what the network might look like and what level of energy generation would be needed to support.
So just to follow up, Mr. Chair, well, that still leaves out West Cambridge and North Point. And as you know, the problem, even with Volpe, is the land value. I grant that MIT owns it, so that's a different factor. What does this mean physically? It's not the old power plant scenario, I know that, but what is it that we have to incorporate? And I realize each site is different, but I mean, is it a 20,000 square foot area or?
Yeah, so that's another question that we're looking into. So through the ALI study that Renewable is doing, we're asking them to give us a kind of general sense of
Right.
that footprint. I think in some of the denser areas of the city, so like Volpe could potentially connect to the existing MIT or Veolia plants, or those sites could be converted to provide energy. In the study, we also looked at siting infrastructure outside of Cambridge. So the Mystic electricity power plant just across the Mystic River, and it's technically part of that one plant. Is technically part of Boston, but it's in Chelsea. And so, could we turn that into a combined heat and power plant? Right now, it's just spewing all of its waste heat into the air. So, could we capture that heat and somehow pipe it into Cambridge? So again, those are some of the follow-up questions that we really need to pursue regionally to understand, particularly on the plant siting, what makes sense.
So the regionality is feasible with some new construction, but if we can reuse what we have, it is a feasible approach. I just hope I'm glad you're working on this so we get to it. My only other comment, well, it's an excellent presentation.
May I make another comment on this question?
Absolutely.
So there's really a lot of flexibility. You can have smaller scale plants that feed a smaller scale area, and you can have very large scale plants feed with tremendous runs of piping. So Veolia currently supplies multiple large institutions. I think MGH is the best known in Boston with steam. So it's not really a question of distance. And the modern district energy plants use super insulated pipes, so there's virtually no loss of energy. There's no line losses on the way, so you can have really long runs. So it's not the study for LWIFE is just to look at an application that would work in that specific area, but there's tremendous range of options.
I thought we were told the streets are so full we can't even get conduit in for cable, so how would we get pipes in?
Well, I mean, if you think about natural gas, replacing that, and, as Suzanne said, there's different scales that this can be done. Eckerd College, where I went to as an undergrad, they use cold water because they mostly need to cool the buildings. And so they have chillers all over campus, and, they're like big AC units on top of buildings or sometimes on a standalone structure. And they have several loops that help cool the campus. So that's a much smaller scale where you could site some of that infrastructure on the buildings potentially even.
So the notion would be utilities would build this, a public entity would build it?
You could.
I think you have to keep in mind the regulatory framework of what triggers you into becoming a utility. So that's one of the complexity when you think about a place like Alewife. So it works for MIT and it works for Harvard because they're only using it on their campus and not actually sharing with anybody else. Otherwise, they would have to be regulated like a utility. So that's kind of the other piece of the puzzle, which is why the regional solution is such an important one to explore.
I cut you off.
No,
You were
that's
gonna say- The only other comment I have is, I know you know what BAU means.
Business
And,
as usual.
yes, and I know it today, but 2 weeks from now, when I look at this, I'm gonna think it's a legal or a technical term, and it's gonna drive me crazy. In the future, if you could just put down what every abbreviation means somewhere, even if it's a glossary, it would be helpful.
And I should mention that the full report is on, it's easy to find on the city website, and that certainly does define all
Oh,
the terms.
cool, see? Great.
Thank you. So,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
thanks for a fabulous presentation. Let's have some public comment and then we can close out if there's sort of discussion. So we have one person is yes and one person's maybe. So Ginger, would you like to speak?
Well, I was a maybe,
Yeah.
and I don't understand what I just heard, so. But, I know Dennis Malone, several years ago, put forth a you know, we have a policy order for 100% municipal electricity that at one report was supposed to be there by 2018. So I was interested in the progress of that, and so I'm trying to understand that it's partly you're trying to change the sources of carbon-free energy. I mean, you know, that you want things more to be local. So it's an interim, but is that going to be, are we going to get to 100% sources of municipal electricity before 2020?
Yeah, please.
So, we have been spending a lot of time trying to develop a matrix of what our values are, if you will, the city's values for a procurement of 100% electricity. So, because there's enormous complexity in terms of like what are the options, and sort of the range could go from buying renewable energy certificates to, as MIT has done, investing directly in a large solar plant in North Carolina, and through a virtual power purchase agreement or synthetic power purchase. It's there's the level of complexity in terms of what the options are, made us want to try to really articulate what are all these things that we're trying to cover, and we now have close to ready to go a request for qualifications to have a consultant help go into the marketplace and find out what are procurement options that are available to us so we can evaluate them. So I guess I don't want to speak to an exact year of 2020,
Okay.
because we have to really understand what options do we have. And this is a very evolving market, right, that has really changed in terms of not the kinds of things that you can procure. So that is very close to being finalized, and we'll be taking that through conversation with the manager in the near term. So it's a very active process.
Pursuit, okay.
Very active pursuit.
Okay, thank you. I guess my other question was way back about, you know, I'm just concerned. I know that it's great that you know, the labs are coming forward and trying to solve this, and we all want to solve this problem, but I'm just wondering if, I guess I have a mistrust of developers, probably because our president is a developer, no. But anyway, that the interests aren't really maybe in line with community interests sometimes, and do we have enough in place to make sure that people will develop buildings in a way that, I mean, I'm concerned that some of this is left up to incentives rather than having restrictions, that's all. Because that's just a concern. And because I also know that we have to balance how to still make the city affordable for everybody, along with all these other ones, and how does, you know, relying, you know, just all, that's a question I have.
Do you want to speak to when the targets kick in and the process for that?
Sure. So if you recall, I could certainly remind you that, you know, the original impetus for the net zero action plan was to require new development to achieve net zero emissions. So we do have a concrete timeline for that, beginning with municipal buildings in 2020, and then small residential in 2022, large residential and commercial in 2025, and labs in 2030. So that's the framework that we have in place, and I think other elements of the net zero action plan framework really try to balance the incentives with the requirements, and I think that's where the veto process along with the custom retrofit program is a really great example. So the goal is to set requirements through veto that would require existing buildings to meet certain levels of performance, and we're figuring out what that is through the stakeholder process. So that's the stick. But then there's a carrot to actually help buildings take action to reduce their energy consumption by developing an effective retrofit program that is cost effective and streamlined to use. And so our goal by, those were two separate actions of the Net Zero Action Plan, and I lobbied to bring forward the custom retrofit program in the action plan timeline, specifically so that it would align with those requirements and that there would be a vehicle for buildings to achieve those retrofits.
I just want to underscore one of the things that Seth said, which is the requirements really apply to primarily new construction, because that's where we have the greatest leverage. But the bulk of our city is already built out, and so in order to transform those existing buildings to be more energy efficient, we need to have much more of an incentive and problem solving, supporting folks to move towards efficiency. That's got to be a big part of our approach. And you know, I agree with you that developer interests are not always in alignment with city interests, but where we're creating energy efficiency and reducing energy use is concerned, there actually is an alignment of interest, especially when you're thinking of really high energy users like labs, because it's such a big part of the expense, that if they're able to reduce that, it's in their interest as well as ours.
Thank you. Anyway.
I wonder what the best, how you would like me to proceed. I have a few things to say, and I have some questions. And is it okay to?
Why don't you join us?
Oh, sure. How about I sit at the head of the table? No, that's the wrong place, because you want to look at that. I was lucky enough to go to the New Building Institute's conference in Pittsburgh on Getting to Zero, where people from all over the country were looking at the issue of getting what they now call getting to zero. The net is probably going away, by the way. Nobody understood what it meant, and so zero seemed good enough. I learned a few things there that I thought were pertinent. I suppose the first thing of all is that, yep, we're really out there. We're in the lead nationally, that there's no city of our size that's doing anything near what we're doing, and we really need to be very proud of where we've gotten to, and the importance of our role as a model and a laboratory for trying new things, such as the lab model. I don't think anybody else even thought about that yet, and of course we have so many labs that it's become terribly important. So it's great to be at a conference like that and be representing cities of like roughly 100,000, be the only one in the quadrant. And I'm here from Cambridge, yes, I'm here. So there were quite a few things that I learned, but I guess a couple of them that I thought were especially pertinent to us were, and I don't really know how this applies, but I think there's a movement now for the Passive House standard for affordable housing. And people may have heard about this because there's at the Energy Efficiency Advisory Committee on the state level, there's been a push from the affordable housing community and other advocates to see that included amongst the standards that are considered when funding affordable housing. I don't know if there's a local angle to that. I don't know if there's a way that we can be favoring affordable housing projects that are also using Passive House standard or something related to that. I just don't know exactly how that would work, but I do know that affordable housing is funded by many different pieces, and we do have our own pieces that we very often introduce, that pieces being money. The other thing that, and it's a very sensitive topic, is around code, and code is a huge instrument in getting energy efficient buildings, and of course we were in the forefront of, only number 2 though, in adopting the stretch code, and I guess there's more things coming from the state level on code. But some places are taking the step of looking to code compliance, and it turns out that even though everybody has the same code, that the level of compliance varies from community to community, and it's a very touchy subject, I understand, because you don't want to come off as the bad guys saying, well, we want to come and inspect and make sure you're doing exactly the right thing. but there's at least one technique that IMT, which is consulted to the city and the board of which I'm on, the Institute for Market Transformation, produced a checklist for Washington D.C. that created an easier way, a road to compliance, I think. So that it was not a stick, it was more, not exactly a carrot, but more like information as a tool. And it seemed like that should be something that be analyzed. There is information about how much code compliance there is, and varies from community to community. And we may know. Do we know how we stand in terms of compliance, whether we get good code compliance or not?
I don't think I can answer that.
We'd have to ask Roger.
My experience as an architect and even design review with Roger Booth is that it's quite high in Cambridge. Certain cities were terrible. I don't know if they still are. One's nearby. And towns vary depending on the one person that refused the drawings. And I suspect a lot of it is the smaller and the very big, and when you just can't keep up. I was impressed. I put 4 buildings through, and they asked the right questions. So at least at that time it was good, and I expect Branchett has kept that up.
Well, I wouldn't be so sure that everything is rosy. Just and so I think that as a, if I was on the city council, I hear a council order coming. Whereas I think it's a territory worth exploring, and I think there are some. It'd be worthwhile finding out how we're doing and what are the best ways to secure compliance in key areas that we're concerned about, particularly.
Well, let me tell you that what happens is our city offices only see a certain amount, and they're relying on the builder and the architect to make sure that gets built, but the architect is not there every day.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't do a lot of technical tests because the developer has to pay for it. So if there's a way of incorporating that extra testing, that's great. That's what LEED does in its own way, it's the testing. We don't test buildings generally.
Well,
Yeah, and that's part of the
That
enhanced
changes,
commissioning
yeah,
that we're
exactly.
proposing. But we should.
Well,
Yeah.
in this case, what I'm suggesting, I think, is a checklist instead, which says to the whoever's responsible for the drawings, have you included, is this something you've done, has this been completed? So it doesn't require the kind of technical, I don't think it requires the kind of technical, go in there and test the building. It's more like the surgical checklist, make sure you didn't leave any tools inside the patient, and things like that. So checklists are very popular now. Battery storage, I think we've got to get to the point of having some battery storage going on and trying out battery storage here. And I would hope that the state is getting to that. I don't know, but
So the
Vermont
water,
is.
the water treatment plant has a approved grant for doing a big storage project, but my understanding is that the state has yet to sign off on the document. So the city has delivered everything signed, and we're waiting for it to come back. But there was a whole feasibility analysis that went ahead to ensure that the project could actually go forward. So,
We've also begun to look at a library and a high school complex in terms of just looking at battery storage options there.
In Vermont, our mutual friend Dave Dayton, he's getting 2 batteries for his house, so that there's for resilience and so on. Let me quickly sort of wrap up and just say that tonight there is a building tech forum sponsored by the U.S. Green Building Council in Boston, if anybody wants to go and find out about what they're calling net positive, since it's not enough to be zero, apparently. So that forum is happening at 5:30 tonight, and it could be very interesting. And I don't know, are you presenting something? No, I think only the not this time. And there's probably going to be good news on on the RPS, I think, I'm hearing that the renewable portfolio standard that will be recommended in the new, as part of legislation, is gonna be, go up somewhat. And the advocates are asking for 3 to 5%, probably gonna be 2.
2.57.
2.5.
2.57.
You got that already?
Well, that's what I read within the hour and a half.
Oh, I didn't get the number yet.
But
But
coming up within a few
2.57.
years, not raised all at once together, but going up to that.
Well,
It's not, obviously
Not
the
everything.
details will come out, but
well, thank you, and thank you for all the work that you all do on this, and, we should all be
to you.
real proud, for sure.
Continuing support.
Well, a little late
All right,
on that
so
on
we
the
will
committee, but we will.
Close public comment.
Oh, I have a quick question.
All right.
Is that possible? I said no, but can I change my mind?
You may propose that, I guess.
I have not yet.
Go ahead.
Okay, I have a question that I'm sorry, Melissa Ludke. I have a quick question for Seth. I was taken by the comment that you made about the idea that the way it currently exists, that electrification would result in more emissions than gas at this point. And my question is whether taken into account with the gas emissions are the methane leaks. And I don't know, we asked that same question in Boston when they released this, and it turned out that they had not taken the methane into account. And of course, the methane adds a whole lot more to this equation when you're making a comparability between these two. So I'm curious whether yours takes into account methane.
No, not for either the point, so the on-site gas, nor for the electricity power plant gas.
So it'd be very interesting to see what that comparison would be if methane were part of your analysis, because of course it's actually part of the gas.
Right, but what he's saying is that we're not taking it into account either way. So whether the gas is going to the power plant to produce electricity or to the house, either way, we're not looking at the methane, so it's still a head-to-head comparison. And of course, if you're burning gas to generate electricity, that's gonna have a higher emissions profile than just.
But if you're using renewables to create the electricity
Right.
source.
But that's not the
That's not
comparison,
current
because the
use,
current
current.
grid is mostly natural gas. So you're mostly using natural gas to produce electricity, then using that electricity to heat your home, that's gonna have a higher emissions profile than burning the gas directly, right? Over time, as we shift the grid.
Yeah, it
it'll
would be
become
great
better.
to keep thinking about what the future is gonna be as opposed to what the current reality
Right,
is.
that's just the
because-
starting point.
Yeah, exactly,
We have to
because it's
start.
happening so quickly.
Well,
With
that's,
these.
that's why I brought it up, is that we want to, we know that we want to incentivize electrification.
Yeah.
So it's about setting up the policy so that it does.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you. One more public comment.
Very quick, and thank you for putting this together and all your efforts. Peggy Barnes-Leonard. And this may be a question for another setting, but I'm curious about the pros and cons of using or incentivizing development around green infrastructure and roof space or green. And if it's not, is it mutually exclusive with solar? Is there a way, in other words, to engineer using both? Because part of the thinking, and I'm not an expert, is that if it's cooler, if you're using green, then you're going to require less energy. And so I don't know, there's collective wisdom in the world. And we've been looking at, as we have developers coming in, what might be the
Yes.
push. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. That came up in the Envision Environment and Climate Working Group discussions. And I think that's one of the things that we'll include in our solar requirement study that we'll be taking on this next year, is understanding the balance. I think our informal understanding is that it can be compatible.
If I could add to that, if in the urban design there is a lower scale element and a higher scale element, something 4 or 5 stories and something higher, the lower scale element could have the green roof, and the upper one, which gets the best light, could have the solar. So, and that would achieve some urban design compatibility as well, trying to fit in.
That's what they're doing across the street from my house.
Are they?
They put in green roof on the
That
lower
was for
section.
you, I was told.
Yes, definitely. All right, so we'll close public comment. Thanks everyone for participating, and then we'll go back to more questions or discussions.
No,
Dennis,
I'm
maybe?
very impressed.
So I'm impressed too. I do have some more questions or maybe just even comments or discussion points, and feel free to respond. So one question I had on biomass, and it is very controversial. I noticed in your study that one of the downsides of local combustion was higher pollution, and I wonder if that was factored into the cost in terms of trying to scrub some of that pollution out so that it wouldn't actually be entering the environment, and what that does to our equation.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So, what Councilor Zondervan is talking about is this number here, which is the particulate emissions. And so this jumped out at us as well as a high value, and one that we were concerned about. So we asked the consultant to look into it. So they did include industry best practice levels of pollution mitigation in their kind of costing of the potential biomass facility. And so that does capture the majority of the particulate emissions. There is still some remaining. They, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but they did compare this to the particulate matter emissions that come from the current Veolia natural gas combined heat and power plant. And these numbers that we see here are significantly lower than that. I think I'd have to check the report. I want to say it's in like the 20s. So you know, it, not that it's not still a matter of concern, and I think, you know, as we get into the kind of, if we were to progress with this and actually thinking about siting, this would be a very concrete concern, and understanding, you know, what the very local impacts are. But that, you know, relatively speaking, while this number is higher than the other ones we see on the chart, it is lower than what we have now. But it's definitely an area that would need further research.
I did a biomass building up in the White Mountains, and it was only 45,000 square feet. It wasn't a huge urban building, and I raised the same concern when they said, "Oh, we have lots of wood. Let's just burn the wood." And they said that it depended on the temperature of how it's heated. That if it's the highest, can't remember what it was called, the unit, that it burned so hot that actually that number went way down. I don't know, but that might cause problems too of having a plant with huge temperatures in an urban area.
Yeah, so again, those are the very technical questions that we get into.
Yeah, there's a lot of complexity to that. Another thing to consider if you're thinking about biomass is biochar.
Which is?
Biochar is like a high-grade charcoal that you make from wood products, and you're mostly burning the gas rather than the wood itself. The gas that comes out of the wood as you heat it up, and so that can lead to lower pollution. And then the biochar itself is a useful soil additive.
Interesting.
And captures carbon as well in a very stable form. So that's, you know, another piece to consider.
And we definitely haven't looked at that, and there's complexities involved in terms of like the amount of biochar you'll be producing, and
Right.
what would be the supply chain
Right.
from
Applicability of
our
that.
production facility to somewhere else, and now you're shipping out, you're shipping in and shipping out.
There's
So it's
only
very
one
complex.
company that provides it in New England. It's Zondervan.
Yeah. Actually, there's two. So I have some specific examples, I guess, that I just want us to think through. So like Vail Court, you know, is going through the process, and hopefully someday soon it'll become a affordable, 100% affordable housing development. So I guess one question is, would that fall under our 2020 municipal net zero requirement, or would it fall under the 2025 multifamily residential net zero requirement?
It would, even though the city owns the property, typically when we build out residential affordable housing projects, we essentially provide the land, put out an RFP, and then have an affordable housing developer, typically a nonprofit, take that on as a project. So it would fall, saying this very quickly without consulting anybody, but my incentives would fall under the multifamily threshold rather than the municipal project.
Right, and so given that, it again might be useful to really codify the net zero ready definition and then maybe include that as a requirement in the RFP so that while it won't be necessarily net zero, it'll at least be net zero ready along with other municipal buildings. Another example that was just presented to me today is a potentially net zero building that would provide a storage facility in the Alewife area. And they're already asking for some potential zoning relief in exchange maybe for going net zero. So that conversation's already happening, and so that would be interesting as a kind of test case to compare to the proposed zoning that we're formulating to see, you know, are these aligned with what's already starting to bubble up in the conversation.
Just to clarify, this is storage of things, not battery
Right.
storage.
Although,
When we say net zero storage,
Right,
it
right,
sounds
so-
like
Oh, I thought it was battery.
no,
it's
stuff,
a storage
furniture.
facility that
Oh,
has
that one.
declared its
Yes.
intention to become a net zero building.
Yeah, great. Great. They're halfway there already.
Right, yeah, exactly, maybe even more than that. Another idea to consider might be similar to our linkage fee where, you know, because as you mentioned, we wouldn't want to penalize buildings that are code compliant, but we could have a sort of across the board linkage fee that says, well, you know, even if you're super net zero, your building is going to have some impact in terms of emissions and other environmental impacts. And so there could be a fee to offset that, which then we could use through the carbon fund or other ways to help fund energy efficiency projects. On the solar ready, I was excited to hear that we're considering leapfrogging it and going straight to solar requirement. I wonder if you can say more than that or not.
I mean, it would be, we are on the trajectory that was laid out by the Net Zero Action Plan. So the Net Zero Action Plan calls for studying a solar requirement in FY19 for potential implementation in FY20. So that's the timeline that we are continuing to pursue. So it seems like we may not need to promulgate a solar ready requirement through zoning because of the state code action and the fact that we're seeing solar ready as a best practice.
Right, but as you mentioned, it's the state regs would be for large buildings, or ready for smaller buildings.
Right.
So we would still have that issue in Cambridge then for larger buildings.
Potentially.
We're starting to find, this is a question that we are asking developers when they come forward as part of the, not necessarily lead requirements, but as part of that building design conversation. And we're finding that most of them are quite receptive to going solar ready. It's when we ask them to actually, you know, consider the installation that we hit more resistance. So, but most of the projects that have been going forward right now through the Article 19, the large project review, are all easily saying that they are designing to be solar ready.
It adds value to the building.
Right,
Yeah.
I mean, it should be a no-brainer. I have had some mixed results in conversations with developers where sure, they might be amenable to it, but they don't always understand that it can be a revenue source effectively. And they also often express concerns about, well, we have to put all this stuff on the roof, all the mechanicals, and so we don't have a lot of space left. And so I think it may be worthwhile still considering the solar ready, also because, in a sense, because the solar makes so much sense and that will continue to increase, it's almost more important to require solar ready than to require solar, because if you're solar ready, then the solar becomes a no-brainer. So if we are able to require solar ready sooner rather than later, and especially because we have this gap with the state regulations, so we could potentially fill that gap with the green building zoning, that could lead to more solar ready buildings, in a couple of years. By the time we're ready to require it, they could easily retrofit it.
Sure. Just in the interest of not spinning our wheels where we're not necessarily, where it's not needed, I think maybe what we'll do is take a look at the recent projects and see if there are any that were not solar ready before we invest energy in developing a requirement.
Makes sense. I was wondering if you could, not on the spot, but maybe over the next few weeks, give us a clearer schedule for when we should expect some of these zoning amendments to come before the council, because
We are
we have
going
quite a
to have
pipeline.
an I haven't mentioned this to you, we're going to have an ordinance committee, ordinance chair community development meeting to go over exactly that, not just environmental, but
Right.
all of the issues, because we jointly realize there could be 10 of them coming down
Right.
the track, and we have to space them out so work can get done, and we'll report back on that.
Great. And then my final comment / question, we did hear from the public that we may see an RPS increase. I'm quite optimistic myself that will come to pass. We're seeing the offshore wind projects getting developed off Martha's Vineyard. So there is hope that the grid will move in the right direction. So, I do wonder a little bit about how much we should maybe try to push that and sort of depend on that versus spending a lot of time on, local options other than solar, which is, again, a no-brainer, but beyond that, some of these biomass considerations and, combustion-based district heating, which, there's a lot of trade-offs there, and it could well be that we end up seeing the grid overtaking those efforts more quickly than we thought.
I should add, to reinforce that point, that the two biomass projects I worked on were remotely located.
Right.
And that was, we had to and it made sense there. That might be one of the reasons that it doesn't make sense in an urban area.
Yeah, there's a lot of impacts. Dennis, you and I were both involved in the restaurant situation where they're trying to burn wood. It's a very dense city, and so there can be a lot of impacts. All right. Any further comments? Anyone?
Other than this was one of the more informative committee meetings we've been on in a long time.
Well, thank you to the staff for a great presentation, and for the public for the presentation. And I'm very excited and optimistic about the progress.
I am too.
Looking forward to the next update. Meeting adjourned.